Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're really getting into it with Sam Altman, one of the absolute key figures in AI.
Definitely. He's everywhere right now.
Exactly. And we've got a whole stack of sources here, articles, research, um, our own notes too, trying to piece together how his personal beliefs, which seem to have really evolved, connect to the whole direction AI is taking.
Right. And our mission really is to get beyond just what he's done. We want to understand why his politics, his changing views, matter so much for how AI gets built, how it gets used, and crucially, how it's governed, or maybe not governed.
Yeah, that governance piece feels huge.
It is, because his path, from being this pretty standard progressive Democrat donor to calling himself politically homeless and championing techno-capitalism, it really shines a light on these bigger questions, doesn't it? Like, who's actually in control of this stuff? And can democracy even keep up?
Okay, let's unpack that transformation then. Because the starting point, as the sources show, was pretty clear, right? Progressive Democrat, over $1 million to Democratic causes up to 2020.
Yep. Pretty standard Silicon Valley progressive, at least on the surface back then.
But then, bam, $1 million for Trump's 2025 inauguration, and he starts describing himself as politically homeless.
Yeah.
That's quite a shift.
It's a huge shift. And what's interesting, like you said, isn't just him. It kind of mirrors this broader thing happening in Silicon Valley, doesn't it? This move towards maybe less regulation, more focus on national competition.
Sort of a techno-nationalism.
You could call it that.
Yeah.
And this repositioning, it wasn't just out of the blue. The sources suggest it started much earlier with a kind of investigative mindset.
Ah, you mean the interviews he did after the 2016 election.
Exactly. Instead of just writing off Trump supporters, he reportedly interviewed about 100 of them. He wanted to understand why they felt the way they did.
Not to judge, but to understand.
That was the idea. And his conclusion, apparently, was that the standard Democratic playbook just wasn't working. It wasn't connecting. And that philosophy seems to have become pretty central to how he leads.
Which leads us to that 2021 essay, Moore's Law for Everything. That feels like a cornerstone piece for understanding his current thinking.
Absolutely. It crystallized this emerging framework instead of old school wealth redistribution.
Which is a deeply political idea.
Right. He proposed this idea of capitalism for everyone, but driven by AI-created abundance. Halving costs every 2 years. Housing, education, healthcare, the big
A
thing.
very tech-centric solution to societal problems.
That's the core of the techno-capitalism he talks about now.
Yeah.
Use technology to create massive wealth, but also figure out ways to spread the benefits widely.
And that connects to his UBI experiments, right? The Universal Basic Income trials.
Directly, he put $60 million of his own money into that.
60 million.
Yeah, and the findings were pretty interesting. Giving people $1,000 a month seemed to boost their autonomy. They used healthcare more.
Did it stop them working?
Yeah.
That's always the big question with UBI.
Only modestly reduced work hours, according to the findings we looked at. So for him, it kind of proved the point. Tech-driven prosperity could actually work, could enhance people's lives.
And then there's that quote, I care much, much more about being American than any political party.
That really sets the lens, doesn't it? National competitiveness becomes the priority for AI.
It becomes the overriding framework, it seems. And that mindset shift wasn't just theoretical. It directly enabled OpenAI's own massive transformation.
Right, from this idealistic nonprofit research lab.
Focused on safety and broad
To
benefits.
this, $300 billion commercial behemoth, that change needed a different structure.
Absolutely. And creating that capped profit structure back in 2019, that was a fundamentally political decision by Altman. He saw they needed huge amounts of capital to compete with Google, with Meta. Capital a nonprofit just couldn't raise.
So this hybrid model was the compromise. Investors could get a return, but capped at 100x, supposedly keeping the mission somewhat intact while fueling growth. It was a balancing act, or at least presented as one, and then the ChatGPT launch in late 2022. That feels like pure Altman political strategy in action.
How so?
Well, sources say there was internal resistance. People worried it wasn't ready, wasn't safe enough. But he pushed for a public release.
Why?
His stated reason was to show the world something important about the future. A belief that technology, especially transformative tech, needs to be out there, accessible for people to understand and grapple with, not kept hidden.
Democratizing it, in a sense.
In a sense. And politically, it was a masterstroke. 300 million users almost overnight. It completely ignited the AI race and put OpenAI at the absolute forefront.
Okay, and what about the partnerships, the Microsoft deal particularly? Was that just about the money, the compute power?
Well, the money was crucial, obviously, that initial $1 billion for infrastructure, but the structure of the deal was also politically calculated, designed to maintain OpenAI's independence, at least on paper.
You mean the AGI clause?
Exactly. The idea that Microsoft's deep access gets limited once OpenAI reaches certain, artificial general intelligence capabilities. Whether that holds up is another question, but it shows the intent to retain control.
And external politics are shaping this too, right?
Constantly. You see tensions now with OpenAI looking at Oracle, maybe Google Cloud diversifying its infrastructure partners. That's partly competitive, partly political maneuvering.
And the government's getting involved directly, like with that Stargate project?
Yes, the reported collaboration with the Trump administration, it shows how AI is becoming embedded in national industrial strategy. Altman's navigating all of this, the corporate partnerships, the government interests. It takes serious political skill.
Okay, so this brings us to a really thorny area.
Yep.
Safety. We've definitely picked up on rumblings, even public statements from former researchers that, quote, safety culture and processes have taken a back seat to shiny products at OpenAI. What's your read on that?
It's a major point of contention, absolutely. And the evidence seems to support those concerns, at least partially. Look at the dissolution of the superalignment team in 2024.
The team focused on long-term AI risks.
That's the one. And key leaders, like Yunlike, left publicly stating they weren't getting the resources, the compute power that were promised.
Which implies safety wasn't the top priority.
It certainly suggests a prioritization issue. And it aligns with Altman's own stated philosophy, which seems to be something like progress through deployment is safer than stagnation through excessive caution. Let's get it out there and learn, rather than waiting until it's theoretically perfect.
Which is a kind of safety philosophy, just a very different one.
A very active, perhaps risk-tolerant one.
And his public stance on regulation has done a complete 180, hasn't it?
It really has. In 2023, he's testifying before Congress, talking about needing federal licenses, a new oversight agency, positioning OpenAI as the responsible leader, calling for guardrails.
Sounding very proactive.
Very. But fast forward to, say, early 2025 in our sources, and he's calling government approval requirements disastrous for American competitiveness.
So what changed? Or what became more important?
It seems that nationalist framework, the U.S. versus China competition lens, just became dominant. Anything that slows down U.S. development is seen as harming national interest.
So the safety committee they set up recently, chaired by Zico Coulter from Carnegie Mellon, is that just window dressing?
Well, it's perhaps a political compromise. It acknowledges the safety concerns, brings in external credibility. But critics, as you'd expect, question whether it has real teeth, whether it can meaningfully constrain development speed if Altman decides otherwise. It looks like governance, but does it function as strong governance? That's the question.
And he's been busy building networks elsewhere, too,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Hiring political operators.
Oh, absolutely. Bringing in Chris Lethane, who is a strategist in the Clinton White House, to run global affairs, that's a big signal. It says, we understand this is a political game, and we need top players.
And the lobbying spend reflects that, too.
Massively. From around $260,000 in 2023 up to, $1.76 million in 2024.
Wow.
Yeah. And the focus is clear. Frame AI infrastructure as vital national security. Frame rapid development as essential to beat China. It's a very targeted political message.
And people like Reid Hoffman, his connections must play a role, too.
Undoubtedly. These networks in Silicon Valley connecting tech, venture capital, and political circles are incredibly important for building consensus and navigating policy.
He's also been working the international stage hard. Those meetings in 2023 with leaders from, 22 different countries.
Right. That was about positioning OpenAI and, by extension, the U.S. model of AI development as the responsible global choice.
The democratic AI versus authoritarian AI framing.
Exactly. It serves multiple purposes. It aligns potential partners ideologically, builds support for American leadership, and subtly frames competitors like China as the less desirable path. It's smart global politics.
Looking at his vision for society, some of his predictions are, frankly, quite alarming. Jobs are definitely going to go away, full stop. Maybe 70% of jobs eliminated?
He doesn't shy away from those stark predictions. But his political approach isn't really about stopping it. It's about adapting society to it through new economic structures.
Like universal basic compute. What exactly is that?
It's an interesting idea. Instead of just giving people money, like UBI, you give everyone access to a certain amount of AI computing power. The thinking is that this would be the key resource in the future economy.
So it's like UBI, but with AI cycles instead of cash.
Kind of. It's a technologically mediated solution to inequality. It tries to bypass the messy political debates about wealth redistribution by offering a technical resource for participation, theoretically.
And then there's the AGI prediction,
Mm.
artificial general intelligence by 2025. That feels incredibly soon, almost unbelievably so.
It's an extremely aggressive timeline, and whether it's technically realistic or not, it serves a powerful political purpose.
How so?
It creates this immense sense of urgency. AGI is right around the corner. We can't slow down now. It justifies breakneck development speed.
It makes calls for regulation seem dangerous.
Precisely. It helps preempt regulatory constraints. We need to win this race. Regulation will just hand the advantage to China. It reframes criticism as being unpatriotic or naive about the stakes. It puts OpenAI and Altman in the driver's seat, pushing everyone else to keep up.
So let's try and tie some of this together. We're talking about governance challenges, democratic implications. Internally at OpenAI, we've seen issues beyond just the safety team, right? Like the shift away from transparency.
Definitely. Moving from publishing research openly, like they did in the early days, to keeping the architecture of GPT-4 completely secret. That clearly shows commercial imperatives winning out over the original nonprofit ideals of openness.
And then the board crisis in November 2023. That was extraordinary. Altman fired, then back in days later after a staff revolt.
That whole episode was incredibly revealing. It showed Altman's absolute centrality. The company seemed unable to function without him. But it also exposed just how fragile and, frankly, inadequate the governance structure was for something this powerful.
And former board members made some pretty serious allegations afterward about psychological abuse.
Yes, those allegations hang in the air, highlighting the intense internal dynamics.
There are also these concerns about practices like restrictive NDAs, non-disparagement agreements, tied to employees losing their equity if they speak out.
Right, these agreements reportedly forbid criticism eternally. And we've seen reports of multiple SEC whistleblower complaints alleging these violate federal protections for whistleblowers. That's serious.
It raises questions about accountability, doesn't it?
Big questions. And it connects to other documented issues, like the labor practices with content moderators in places like Kenya.
Paid incredibly low wages for doing really traumatic work, labeling harmful content.
Exactly, like $1.32 to $2 an hour. And then reports of whole teams being robo-fired if they try to organize for better conditions.
So despite the talk of universal benefit,
The actual development process can reinforce or even worsen global inequalities. Can the current governance structures, internal or external, actually address these contradictions? That's a critical point.
which brings us back to that core challenge, democratic control.
Mm.
You have this immense power concentrating in a few companies,
Yeah.
led by figures like Altman, with governance structures that seem insufficient, maybe even broken. And traditional democratic institutions are struggling to catch up.
I think that's right. Sam Altman's journey, his political evolution, really encapsulates these huge tensions we're seeing everywhere between technology, democracy, and raw power. What he's done at OpenAI represents maybe a new model for how AI is governed,
A model that seems to prioritize speed, commercial success, and national advantage.
over maybe more cautious safety approaches, democratic accountability, or global cooperation. And the stark contradictions between the stated mission AI for the benefit of all humanity and some of these documented practices, well, they suggest that just relying on voluntary commitments from these companies might not be enough.
So the thought we want to leave you, the listener, with is this. Can this techno-capitalist approach, the one Altman seems to embody, actually deliver on its promise of broad benefits while staying compatible with democratic values? Or does it inherently risk concentrating so much power that it ends up undermining the very freedoms it claims to uphold? What really stands out to you as you hear about this intersection of AI, power, and politics?